What would you do if saving your beloved dog led to a battle for everything you own? Eleanor risked her life to rescue Rusty from danger, but soon found herself fighting an even bigger threat, a ruthless developer trying to steal her land. Like the video and write in the comments where you are watching from. Eleanor Harper had lived in Cedar Grove, Alabama for most of her 74 years. The town was small, the kind of place where everybody knew each other, where the rhythm of life was slow and predictable. But today was anything but predictable. She held the leash of her golden retriever, Rusty, as they strolled down a familiar dirt path near her home. The watery afternoon sun warmed her back, and the scent of fresh pine filled the air. Rusty, wagging his tail, tugged slightly ahead, sniffing the ground for any new and interesting scents. "Slow down, boy," Eleanor chuckled, adjusting her grip. "I may not be as quick as I used to be, but I can still keep up." Rusty turned his head and gave her a happy bark, his golden fur shimmering under the sunlight. He was more than just a pet. He was family, her constant companion after her husband passed away 5 years ago. They walked toward the small wooden bridge that crossed over Lawson Creek. Eleanor had crossed this bridge 1,000 times without incident. But today something was different. A faint rumbling noise reached her ears, growing louder with each step. She frowned, pausing at the entrance of the bridge. Rusty, however, didn't stop. His attention locked onto something beyond the creek, and before Eleanor could tighten her grip, he lunged forward. The leash slipped from her frail hands. "Rusty, no," she cried. Her heart pounded as she watched him sprint onto the bridge. The old planks groaned beneath his paws. Then she saw it, coming down the road parallel to the creek, a massive log truck barreling toward the bridge's intersection. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The bridge was narrow, only wide enough for one vehicle at a time. The truck's driver wouldn't see Rusty until it was too late. Rusty, oblivious to the danger, had stopped in the middle of the bridge, sniffing at something on the wooden planks. Panic surged through Eleanor. She could see the truck's speed. The driver wasn't slowing down. She had seconds to act. Ignoring the protests of her aching knees, she sprinted forward, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Rusty, come!" she shouted. But Rusty, distracted, didn't move. The rumbling grew deafening. The truck was coming. Eleanor pushed herself harder, her legs screaming in pain, but she didn't care. All that mattered was reaching him. She lunged forward, arms outstretched, fingers just grazing his fur. Would she make it in time? Eleanor's fingers brushed against Rusty's fur, but he didn't budge. The golden retriever had fixated on a crumpled paper bag caught between the planks, his tail wagging as he pawed at it. The log truck roared closer, the driver still unaware of the danger ahead. Eleanor had no time to think. With one final burst of strength, she grabbed Rusty's collar and yanked him backward with all her might. The dog let out a startled yelp, but she didn't loosen her grip. Her foot slipped on the uneven wooden planks. For a split second, she felt herself falling, her balance gone. Then, with a sharp twist of her body, she shoved Rusty to safety, sending him skidding onto solid ground just as the truck's tires screamed against the pavement. The monstrous vehicle thundered onto the bridge. Eleanor had no time to move. The truck whooshed past her, the force of the wind in Waltery knocking her off her feet. She staggered backward, her heart slamming against her ribs, her hands trembling as she clutched the wooden railing for dear life. A cloud of dust and exhaust fumes engulfed the bridge as the truck sped away, completely unaware of the catastrophe that had in Waltery unfolded. Silence settled in the wake of the chaos. Eleanor's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. Her legs felt weak, her body shaking from the rush of adrenaline. She turned her head, searching frantically for Rusty. There he was. The golden retriever stood a few feet away, his ears perked up, his brown eyes filled with confusion. When their eyes met, he let out a small whimper and took a tentative step forward. "Oh, Rusty," Eleanor exhaled, her voice breaking. She reached for him, and he closed the distance in an instant, pressing his warm body against her legs. She buried her fingers in his fur, steadying herself as relief flooded her. For a long moment, she just stood there holding onto him, her heart still racing. Then she felt it, a sharp, searing pain in her right ankle. She winced and took a cautious step, but her leg buckled beneath her. She gripped the bridge railing, sucking in a breath as pain shot up from her foot. "Great," she muttered under her breath. "Now what?" The realization hit her all at once. She was stranded. The nearest house was at least half a mile away. Her cell phone was in her purse, sitting on the kitchen counter where she'd forgotten it. And now with her ankle throbbing and her legs weak, walking all the way home seemed impossible. If you're yet to like the video, do so now so more people can find the story. And let's know in the comments where you're watching from. Rusty whined, pressing his nose against her palm as if sensing her distress. Eleanor sighed, looking around. There had to be a way out of this. She just needed to think. Eleanor took a slow breath, willing herself to think past the pain in her ankle. She couldn't just stand here waiting for someone to magically appear. Cedar Grove wasn't the kind of town where people passed by every few minutes. The bridge was tucked away on a quiet back road, rarely used except for trucks hauling lumber from the mill. She glanced down at Rusty. His tail wagged uncertainly, ears flicking back as if he, too, sensed her predicament. "All right, boy," she muttered, resting a hand on his head. "We need a plan." She tested her weight on her right foot again. Bad idea. The pain shot up her leg like fire, involuntarily making her collapse. A sprain? A fracture? She had no way of knowing. All she knew was that she wouldn't be walking a half-mile home on it. Her gaze drifted to the trees lining the road. Maybe if she could find a sturdy stick to use as a cane, she could limp her way back. But just as she was about to sit down and collect herself, Rusty suddenly perked up. His ears stood straight, and his nose twitched. Then he took off. "Rusty!" "No!" Eleanor called, her voice hoarse. Panic flared in her chest as she watched him dart toward the other end of the bridge and disappear into the trees. Not again. Terror seized her at the thought of him running into another danger, but she could do nothing but clutch the railing, helplessly scanning the area for any sign of him. Seconds crawled by. The rustling of leaves and snapping of twigs echoed from the woods. Then footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. Eleanor stiffened. A shadow moved between the trees, growing larger as it approached. She braced herself, gripping the bridge railing tighter, heart pounding. Then finally a figure emerged. A man, tall, stocky, wearing a dusty blue shirt and faded jeans, stepped onto the road. His weathered face twisted in concern as he took in the scene before him. "Miss Harper." Eleanor blinked in surprise. She knew that voice. "Walter." Walter Simmons, the town's handyman, adjusted his ball cap as he closed the distance between them. Rusty trotted beside him, tail wagging like he'd just completed the most important mission of his life. "He came right up to me, whining like something was wrong," Walter said, giving Rusty a scratch behind the ears. "Figured I'd better follow him." Relief flooded Eleanor so fast she involuntarily lost her balance. "Thank goodness," she breathed. "I think I hurt my ankle." Walter's brow furrowed as he stepped closer. "Can you put any weight on it?" "Not without feeling like my leg's about to snap." He let out a low whistle. "Well, we can't leave you out here." Walter glanced toward his truck, parked just beyond the tree line. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you home." Eleanor hesitated for only a second before nodding. Walter Simmons had been around Cedar Grove as long as she had. He fixed everything from leaky roofs to busted fences, and though he was rough around the edges, he wasn't the type to leave someone stranded. Still, she hated feeling helpless. Walter must have seen the hesitation in her face because he gave a reassuring nod. "Ain't no trouble, Miss Harper. I'll get you home safe." She sighed. "All right, but let's do this carefully. I don't want to make it worse." Walter stepped beside her, offering his arm. She grabbed it, wincing as she carefully shifted her weight. The pain flared again, but with his support, she managed to hobble forward. Rusty stayed close, watching her with worried eyes. "I swear, this dog of yours is something special," Walter said as they slowly made their way off the bridge. "Most dogs would have run off, but he came straight to me." "Smart boy." Eleanor smiled weakly, rubbing Rusty's head as they walked. "He saved me as much as I saved him." They reached Walter's truck, an old red Chevy with rust creeping along the edges. He opened the passenger door and helped her ease onto the seat. "Let me see that ankle real quick," he said, crouching beside her. Eleanor reluctantly lifted her foot, allowing him to inspect it. Walter gently pressed around the swollen area, his fingers callous but careful. She hissed when he hit a tender spot. "Looks bad, but I don't think it's broken," he said, standing up. "Still, you ought to get it checked." "You want me to take you to Doc Harris?" Eleanor shook her head. "Just take me home. I'll ice it and see how it feels." Walter studied her for a moment but didn't argue. "All right, your call." He shut the door and walked around to the driver's side. Rusty leaped onto the bench seat between them, settling in as if he belonged there. With a turn of the key, the engine rumbled to life and they pulled onto the road. The ride was quiet at first, the hum of the engine filling the space. Eleanor leaned her head back, exhaustion settling in now that the adrenaline had worn off. After a moment, Walter spoke. "You know that was a close call back there." She let out a dry chuckle. "You think?" Walter shook his head. "I mean it, Miss Harper." If that truck had been a second faster, he didn't finish the sentence, but the weight of what could have happened hung between them. Eleanor exhaled, running her fingers through Rusty's fur. "I know." Walter glanced at her. "You need to be careful out there. You ain't got anyone at home to help if something happens." Eleanor stiffened at the reminder. She was alone. And today had proven just how dangerous that could be. Eleanor stared out the window as Walter drove, his words lingering in her mind. "You ain't got anyone at home to help if something happens." She hated admitting it, but he was right. Ever since her husband passed, she'd been managing fine, or so she thought. But today had been a wake-up call. If Walter hadn't come along, she'd still be stuck on that bridge, injured and unable to get home. Rusty nudged her hand, sensing her unease. She scratched behind his ears absent-mindedly. Walter cleared his throat. "You know, Miss Harper, there's no shame in asking for help. Folks in town care about you." Eleanor sighed. "I know, Walter. I just don't like depending on people." He chuckled. "Yeah, I figured. Stubborn as ever." She smirked. "Takes one to know one." A few minutes later, they pulled into her gravel driveway. Her house was a modest white cottage with blue shutters, surrounded by towering oak trees. Walter parked, then hopped out and hurried to her side to help her down. "You got any ice packs inside?" he asked as he carefully guided her up the porch steps. "In the freezer," she said. He nodded. "Good. You get inside, sit yourself down, and I'll grab one for you." Eleanor didn't argue. Her ankle was throbbing worse now that she wasn't moving. She eased into her favorite armchair as Walter disappeared into the kitchen. Rusty sat at her feet, watching her closely. A moment later, Walter returned with an ice pack wrapped in a dish towel. He handed it to her, and she placed it gently on her swollen ankle, wincing at the cold. "Gonna feel worse before it gets better," Walter said, settling onto the couch. She nodded, exhaling slowly. "I appreciate this, Walter. Really." He waved a hand. "Ain't nothin'. Just glad you and Rusty are all right." Silence settled between them. Then Walter leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Listen. I don't mean to overstep, but you really ought to think about getting someone to check in on you." Eleanor frowned. "Like who?" "I don't know. Maybe hire some help around the house. Or at least let someone in town know to stop by now and then." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, but the truth was she had been feeling the weight of living alone more lately. Little things, like hauling groceries or fixing a leaky faucet, weren't as easy as they used to be. Walter must have noticed her hesitation. "Just think about it, all right?" She sighed. "I'll think about it." He stood, clapping his hands together. "Good. Now you need anything else before I go?" She shook her head. "I'll be fine. Thank you, Walter." He tipped his hat. "Anytime, Miss Harper." As the door closed behind him, she looked down at Rusty, who thumped his tail against the floor. "Looks like we might have some changes to make, boy." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the ice pack numbing her swollen ankle. She could still hear the sound of Walter's truck rumbling down the gravel driveway, fading into the distance. Rusty rested his head on her knee, his warm brown eyes fixed on her as if waiting for her next move. She sighed, running a hand through his soft fur. "Well, boy, looks like we got some thinking to do." The truth was Walter had a point. Today had been too close for comfort. If Rusty hadn't found help, if she hadn't been able to get off that bridge in time, she didn't even want to finish the thought. But the idea of asking for help? That was a harder pill to swallow. She had always prided herself on her independence. Ever since she lost her husband, she had managed on her own. She kept up with the house, did her own shopping, and handled things just fine. But maybe, just fine wasn't good enough anymore. She glanced at the old landline phone sitting on the side table. Maybe it was time to call her niece Rebecca. Rebecca had been pestering her for months to let her help out more. "Aunt Eleanor, you don't have to do everything yourself," she'd said the last time they talked. "I could come by once a week, just to check in." At the time, Eleanor had brushed it off. She hadn't wanted to be a burden. But now? She sighed, reaching for the phone. Rusty lifted his head as if sensing the shift in her decision. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then dialed the familiar number. It rang twice before Rebecca's cheerful voice answered. Aunt Eleanor? This is a surprise. Eleanor chuckled. Hope it's a good one. Of course. How are you? There was a pause. Eleanor exhaled slowly. I could use some help, sweetheart. The words felt strange coming out of her mouth, but once they were spoken, a weight lifted from her chest. Rebecca's voice softened. I'm so glad you called. What happened? Eleanor explained the whole ordeal. The bridge, the truck, the twisted ankle, and how Rusty had found Walter. Rebecca gasped. Aunt Eleanor, that could have been really bad. I know, she admitted. That's why I'm calling. Rebecca didn't hesitate. I'll be there tomorrow. We'll figure something out. Eleanor smiled, feeling an unfamiliar sense of relief. I'd like that. After they hung up, she set the phone down and leaned back, shaking her head. Guess I'm not as invincible as I thought, she murmured. Rusty wagged his tail in agreement. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt like she wasn't facing things alone. The next morning, Eleanor sat in her armchair with her foot propped up, watching as Rusty dozed at her feet. The swelling in her ankle had gone down slightly, but the stiffness made it clear she wouldn't be moving around much today. She heard the crunch of tires in her driveway and glanced toward the window. A moment later, the sound of a car door closing confirmed it. Rebecca had arrived. Rusty perked up, ears twitching as the front door swung open. Aunt Eleanor? Rebecca's voice rang out. In here, sweetheart, Eleanor called. Seconds later, her niece stepped into the living room, concern etched across her face. Rebecca was in her Waltery 40s, with warm brown eyes and her mother's strong features. She had always been a force of energy, and today was no different. She took one look at Eleanor's ankle and shook her head. Oh, Aunt Eleanor, you really did a number on yourself, she said, setting her purse down and coming to kneel beside the chair. I'll be fine, Eleanor said with a dismissive wave. Rebecca arched an eyebrow. That's what you always say. Eleanor smirked. And I'm still here, aren't I? Rebecca sighed, but her lips twitched in amusement. All right, stubborn. But I'm not leaving until we figure something out. She gently lifted the ice pack to check the swelling, nodding in approval. At least it's not worse. Eleanor leaned back. I already know what you're going to say. Rebecca crossed her arms. Oh, do you? You think I should hire someone? A home aide or something? Rebecca tilted her head. That's one option. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. But, Rebecca said, pulling up a chair. I was actually thinking of something different. Eleanor waited as her niece took a deep breath. I want you to come stay with me for a while. Eleanor blinked. Come where? With me, Rebecca repeated. Just for a little bit until your ankle heals. You'd have help, I'd know you're safe, and you wouldn't have to worry about a thing. Eleanor stiffened. Rebecca, Hear me out, Rebecca interrupted gently. You're independent. I get it. But if something had happened yesterday, if Rusty hadn't found Walter, who knows how long you would have been stuck out there? That scared me, Aunt Eleanor. And I don't want to get a call one day when it's too late. Eleanor fell silent. She glanced at Rusty, who looked between them as if sensing the weight of the conversation. Finally, she sighed. I don't know, sweetheart. This is my home. Rebecca reached out and squeezed her hand. I'm not asking you to give it up. Just take a break. Let me take care of you for a change. Eleanor hesitated. For the first time, she considered it. Eleanor let out a slow breath, staring at the floral pattern on her living room rug. The idea of leaving her home, even temporarily, made her uneasy. She'd lived here for over 40 years. This was where she and her late husband had built a life together, where every creaking floorboard held a memory. Rebecca must have sensed her hesitation. Aunt Eleanor, it wouldn't be forever, she said softly. Just long enough for you to heal up. And Rusty can come too, of course. At the sound of his name, Rusty lifted his head and wagged his tail, completely oblivious to the weight of the decision before her. Eleanor pursed her lips. I don't doubt you take good care of me, Rebecca, but this house is my life. I know where everything is. I have a routine. Rebecca nodded, not pushing. I understand. But let me ask you something. What happens if you hurt yourself again before you're fully healed? What if it's worse next time? Eleanor hated that she didn't have a good answer. Rebecca leaned in. Look, I don't want to take you away from your home. But just for a few weeks, wouldn't it be nice to have someone else do the cooking? Someone to help you get around? You could actually rest instead of pushing through the pain like I know you're going to. Eleanor smirked at that. Her niece knew her too well. Silence stretched between them as she weighed the choice in her mind. She looked down at Rusty, rubbing his ears absent-mindedly. What do you think, boy? You up for a little adventure? Rusty thumped his tail against the floor. Rebecca grinned. I'll take that as a yes. Eleanor exhaled, rubbing her forehead. She hated feeling like an invalid, but she couldn't deny that the thought of being cared for, even just for a little while, felt nice. Finally, she nodded. All right, but only for 2 weeks. Rebecca's face lit up. That's all I ask. Eleanor pointed a finger at her. And you're not treating me like some fragile old woman. No hovering. Rebecca held up her hands. No hovering. Promise. Eleanor sighed as if she couldn't believe what she was agreeing to. Lord help me. Rebecca clapped her hands together. All right then. How about I help you pack a bag, and we'll head out after lunch? Eleanor groaned. You're not wasting any time, are you? Rebecca winked. Nope. Gotta get you settled before you change your mind. Eleanor chuckled despite herself. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. A few hours later, Eleanor sat on her porch, a packed suitcase by her side and Rusty's leash in her lap. The sun cast a warm glow over the fields surrounding her home, and a slight breeze rustled the trees. It was a peaceful afternoon, the kind she had always cherished. But today it felt different, like she was leaving something behind. Rebecca loaded the last of Eleanor's things into the trunk of her SUV, then dusted off her hands. All right, that's everything. You ready? Eleanor sighed, taking one last look at her house. Not really. But let's go before I change my mind. Rebecca gave her a knowing smile, then helped her to her feet. Rusty trotted beside them, tail wagging, completely unbothered by the change of plans. As they pulled onto the road, Eleanor watched her home shrink in the side mirror. I expect you to bring me back exactly in 2 weeks, she reminded Rebecca. Rebecca chuckled. Yes, ma'am. But who knows? You might end up liking it at my place. Eleanor scoffed. Don't hold your breath. The drive into town was quiet, save for the soft hum of the radio and Rusty's occasional sniffing at the window. Eleanor couldn't help but feel a little restless. She was used to being the one in control, setting her own schedule, managing her own time. The thought of being dependent, even temporarily, unsettled her. Still, she had to admit there was a certain relief in letting someone else handle things for a change. About 20 minutes later, Rebecca pulled into the driveway of a modest but charming brick home with a neatly trimmed yard. Home sweet home, she said, turning off the engine. Eleanor eyed the house. It was nice, but it wasn't hers. Rebecca came around to help her out, but Eleanor swatted her hand away. I can walk, thank you very much. Rebecca smirked. Just making sure. Inside, the house smelled of fresh coffee and lavender, and the living room was tidy and inviting. Rebecca had already set up a cozy corner for Eleanor with a reclining chair, a soft throw blanket, and even a small basket for Rusty's toys. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. You didn't waste any time. Rebecca shrugged. I like to be prepared. Rusty sniffed around before plopping down beside the recliner, completely at ease. Eleanor sat down slowly, letting out a small sigh as she propped her foot up. Rebecca smiled. See? Not so bad, right? Eleanor rolled her eyes. Ask me again in a week. Rebecca laughed, then handed her a glass of iced tea. Well, for now, just relax. You're officially off duty. Eleanor huffed but took a sip anyway. Maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. The first couple of days at Rebecca's house passed by uneventfully, but for Eleanor, it felt like time was crawling. She wasn't used to sitting still while someone else handled everything. Rebecca had insisted she take it easy, which meant no cooking, no cleaning, and no fussing over things that didn't need fussing over. At first, Eleanor had grumbled about it, but she had to admit, having meals prepared and hot tea brought to her chair was a luxury she hadn't experienced in years. Rusty, on the other hand, adjusted immediately. He had taken to Rebecca's house like he'd lived there all his life, curling up in the sunspots near the window and charming Rebecca into giving him extra treats. You've spoiled my dog already, Eleanor muttered on the third afternoon, watching as Rebecca fed Rusty, a tiny piece of chicken from her lunch plate. Rebecca smirked. He's just getting the VIP treatment, same as you. Eleanor shook her head. We're both going to leave here fat and lazy. Rebecca laughed, sitting down across from her. Well, maybe you'll finally get some rest, which is what you needed in the first place. Eleanor sipped her tea but didn't argue. She did feel more rested than she had in a long time, though she wasn't about to admit it out loud. Just as she set her cup down, Rebecca's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen and frowned. Ha! It's Walter. Eleanor sat up a little. Walter. Rebecca answered quickly. Hey, Walter, what's up? She listened for a moment, then her expression turned serious. Wait, what? Eleanor's stomach tightened. What is it? Rebecca held up a finger, still listening. Yeah. Okay. We'll be there soon. She hung up and looked at Eleanor with concern. That was Walter. He said we need to get back to your house now. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Why? What's wrong? Rebecca grabbed her keys. He didn't say much, just that there's a problem and you need to come right away. Eleanor was already trying to stand. Well, don't just stand there. Let's go. Rebecca rushed over to help, but Eleanor waved her off. I'll manage. Just get us there quick. Within minutes, they were in the car, speeding back down the road toward Eleanor's house. Eleanor's mind raced. What could be wrong? Had something happened to her property? Was there damage? Or worse, had someone broken in? Her fingers tightened around Rusty's leash as he sat beside her in the back seat, sensing her tension. As they turned onto her road, a new worry crept into her chest. Walter wasn't the kind of man to panic. If he called, it had to be serious. As Rebecca's SUV sped down the country road, Eleanor's hands gripped the seatbelt across her chest. Her stomach churned with unease. Walter wasn't one for dramatics, and if he'd said there was a problem, she believed him. Rusty, usually calm on car rides, was restless in the back seat, shifting his weight and whining softly. Eleanor reached over and rubbed his head. I don't like this either, boy, she murmured. Rebecca glanced at her. Try not to panic until we know what's going on. Eleanor shot her a look. I don't panic. I prepare. They turned onto Eleanor's long driveway, and the moment the house came into view, her breath hitched. Walter stood in the yard, arms crossed, and just beyond him, near the front steps, was a man she did not recognize. The stranger was tall, dressed in dusty jeans and a work shirt, and had the look of someone who should not be there. His hands rested on his hips as he talked to Walter, but Eleanor could see the tension in Walter's posture. Rebecca slowed the car but didn't turn off the engine. Who the heck is that? Eleanor shook her head. I have no idea. Before the car had fully stopped, she opened the door. Rebecca reached for her. Aunt Eleanor, wait. But Eleanor was already out, hobbling toward Walter with Rusty at her side. Walter, she called. What in the world is going on? Walter turned, his expression serious. Eleanor, we got a problem. She barely spared the stranger a glance. You don't say. The man cleared his throat. Ma'am, I'm sorry to show up like this, but... Eleanor held up a hand. You hush. I don't know you and I didn't invite you here. The man hesitated, then pressed his lips together. Walter sighed. Eleanor, this here is Raymond Hayes. He's a land developer. Says he bought the old Davis property next door. Eleanor frowned. So, Raymond shifted uncomfortably. There's a problem with the property lines, ma'am. Eleanor's gut twisted. What kind of problem? Raymond pulled a folded document from his back pocket and offered it to her. According to the county records, part of my land extends onto yours, including the area where your garden is. Eleanor snatched the paper but didn't look at it. Her garden? The place she had tended for decades? Rebecca stepped up, arms crossed. That can't be right. Raymond sighed. I didn't come here to cause trouble. I just wanted to talk it over before lawyers got involved. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. You want my land? You're gonna have a fight on your hands, Mr. Hayes. The tension thickened as silence settled over them. Raymond let out a slow breath, seal Waltery trying to stay patient. Ma'am, I'm not trying to take anything from you unfairly. I'm just following what the records show. Eleanor tightened her grip on the paper he had handed her. She knew her land, every inch of it. The idea that some developer thought he could walk in and claim part of it made her blood boil. Rebecca took the document from her and unfolded it. She scanned the page, her expression darkening. Where did you get this? She asked Raymond. The county records office, he said. It's all documented. Apparently, This mistake happened years ago when the Davis property was sold. The lines were never corrected. Eleanor's jaw clenched. Mistake or not, that garden is mine. I've tended it since my husband was alive. I buried my time and effort in that soil. Walter cleared his throat. And you're telling me there's no way to fix this without Eleanor losing her land? Raymond shifted his weight. The only way would be for her to repurchase that section, but legally it's part of my parcel now. Rebecca scoffed. So you're saying she has to buy back land that's been hers in every way that matters? Raymond hesitated, then shrugged. I know how it sounds, but I'm just following the paperwork. If you're yet to like the video, do so now so more people can find the story. And let's know in the comments where you're watching from. Eleanor's nostrils flared. And what if I say no? Raymond rubbed the back of his neck. Then, I'd have to move forward with my plans. Rebecca narrowed her eyes. And what plans are those exactly? Raymond exhaled sharply. I'm building houses. Subdivisions. That area of land would be cleared. Eleanor felt a jolt of rage so sharp it made her hands tremble. You mean to tell me you tear up my garden? Raymond held up his hands. I don't want to upset you, but… Oh, you don't. Eleanor snapped. Then take your papers and march yourself back to wherever you came from, because I'm not moving an inch. Rusty, sensing her frustration, let out a low growl. His ears perked, and his stance stiffened. Walter took a step forward. Eleanor, let's not do anything hasty. Eleanor's eyes blazed. You listen to me, Raymond Hayes. You may have paperwork, but I've got something stronger than that. I've got history. I've got years of sweat, heartache, and memories in that soil. If you think I'm going to roll over because some bureaucrat made a mistake, you're sorely mistaken. Raymond hesitated, as if realizing he'd walked into a much bigger fight than he expected. Rebecca smirked. I'd listen to her if I were you. Eleanor crossed her arms. Now I suggest you leave before I decide to start really fighting this. Raymond studied her for a long moment, then sighed. I'll be in touch, he said before walking back to his truck. Eleanor didn't move, watching him drive away, her heart hammering. This wasn't over. As Raymond's truck disappeared down the road, Eleanor's fists remained clenched at her sides. Rusty, still tense, gave a low whine and nudged her leg as if sensing her frustration. Rebecca let out a sharp breath. You weren't kidding about people trying to take what's yours. Walter ran a hand over his balding head. Eleanor, I've known you a long time, and I ain't never seen you back down from a fight. But this could get ugly. Eleanor turned to him, her gaze steely. Then I guess I'll have to make it uglier. Rebecca smirked. I like that attitude. Walter sighed. Now hold on. I'm not saying you should let this man take your land. I'm just saying you need to be smart about it. You don't want to go in all fire and fury without a plan. Eleanor exhaled slowly. He was right. Charging in without a strategy wouldn't get her anywhere. She needed to be prepared. She turned to Rebecca. You're good at digging up information. Think you can find anything on this Raymond Hayes? Rebecca grinned. Oh, you know I can. Eleanor nodded, then looked at Walter. And you still know people at the county office? Walter gave a slow smile. I might. Eleanor's lips curled upward. Then it's time we found out just how airtight this mistake really is. 2 days later. Rebecca slammed her laptop shut with a victorious grin. I knew something wasn't right about this guy. Eleanor and Walter sat across the table from her, leaning in. What did you find? Eleanor asked. Rebecca tapped the closed laptop. Raymond Hayes doesn't just develop land. He's been involved in several shady deals where property records mysteriously shifted in his favor. Walter whistled. You're telling me he's done this before? Rebecca nodded. Yep. In 3 different counties. Every time he discovers a mistake in the records and pressures the landowners into either selling or giving up their land. And get this, each time someone on the inside at the records office was involved. Eleanor's jaw tightened. So he's got people working with him. Exactly. Rebecca pulled up another document. And this so-called error on your property line? It only appeared in the latest set of records. Before that, the county maps show your property line exactly where it should be. Eleanor's fingers curled against the table. That snake. He's trying to steal my land. Walter exhaled. Well, at least now we got proof. Eleanor's eyes gleamed with determination. Then it's time we turn the tables on Mr. Hayes. The next morning, Eleanor stood on her porch, sipping a cup of hot coffee as she stared out at her garden. The morning sun bathed the plants in golden light, making the leaves shimmer with dew. This land had been hers for decades, and she'd be darned if she was going to let some crook take it from her. Rebecca stepped outside, holding a stack of papers. I pulled the original county records before they were mysteriously updated. She handed the documents to Eleanor. See this? She pointed to the old boundary lines. Your land hasn't changed in 50 years. But suddenly, last year, poof, Raymond Hayes owns a chunk of it. Walter joined them, rubbing his chin. Sounds like someone in the records office is on his payroll. Eleanor nodded. Then we need to make some noise. Rebecca grinned. I was hoping you'd say that. She pulled out her phone. I already contacted a local reporter. A woman named Lisa Grayson. She's been investigating shady land deals like this for months. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. And she's interested? Rebecca smirked. Oh, very interested. A few hours later, Lisa Grayson pulled up in a small sedan, stepping out with a notebook and camera crew in tow. She was a sharp-looking woman in her late 30s, dressed in a sleek blue blazer. Mrs. Tate? She asked, extending a hand. Eleanor shook it firmly. Call me Eleanor. And this is my niece Rebecca and my good friend Walter. Lisa smiled. Nice to meet you all. I've done some digging on Raymond Hayes. This isn't the first time he's pulled a stunt like this, but if we expose him publicly, we might just stop him from doing it again. Eleanor's lips curled into a smile. Well, Lisa, you've come to the right place. For the next hour, they walked through the property as Lisa asked questions, her crew capturing footage of the garden and the surrounding land. Eleanor spoke passionately, explaining how long she had lived there, how much time and effort had gone into the land, and how suspicious it was that her property lines had mysteriously changed. Lisa nodded. This will air tonight. If Hayes is watching, he's going to have some explaining to do. Rebecca smirked. And if he wasn't watching, I'll make sure he sees it. Eleanor's eyes gleamed. Good. Let's see how he handles some real pressure. That evening, Eleanor sat in her living room, watching the local news as Lisa's report aired. Rebecca had made sure to tag every major social media page in town, and within minutes, the online comments were exploding. Then, just as the segment ended, Eleanor's phone rang. She picked it up, already knowing who it was. A slow smile spread across her face. Well, she said. Looks like someone's got something to say. Eleanor let the phone ring twice before answering. She wanted Raymond Hayes to stew for a moment. Finally, she pressed the button and lifted the phone to her ear. This is Eleanor. There was a brief pause before Raymond's voice came through, tense and clipped. Mrs. Tate, we need to talk. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, a satisfied smile tugging at her lips. Well, isn't that interesting? Because 2 days ago, you were real certain about your claim to my land. What's changed? Raymond exhaled sharply. Look, I don't want to do this over the phone. Let's meet in person. Eleanor glanced at Rebecca and Walter, who were listening in. Rebecca mouthed, don't trust him, but Walter gave a slow nod, as if to say hear him out. Eleanor tapped her fingers against the arm of her chair. Fine. Tomorrow morning. My place. 8 o'clock sharp. And don't be late. Raymond hesitated before replying, I'll be there. Eleanor hung up without another word. She turned to Rebecca and Walter. He's feeling the heat. Rebecca folded her arms. Or he's trying to weasel his way out of this. Walter sighed. Either way, we'll be ready. The next morning, 8 a.m., Raymond Hayes pulled up to Eleanor's house in a black truck, stepping out in crisp business attire. He looked uncomfortable, not quite the confident man who had shown up days before, claiming her land was his. Eleanor stood on her porch, arms crossed, with Rebecca and Walter flanking her like sentinels. Rusty lay at her feet, watching Raymond with cautious eyes. Raymond climbed the steps, stopping a few feet away. Mrs. Tate, he said with a stiff nod. Eleanor tilted her head. You seem a little less sure of yourself this morning, Mr. Hayes. Raymond sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, I'll be honest. I didn't expect this to blow up the way it did. Rebecca scoffed. You mean you didn't expect to get caught? Raymond ignored her. The truth is, I don't want a legal battle. This isn't worth the trouble for me. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. So what are you saying? Raymond hesitated. I'll withdraw my claim to the land. Silence hung in the air for a moment. Eleanor studied him carefully. Just like that. Raymond nodded. Yeah. I spoke to my contacts at the records office and they'll reverse the mistake. You keep your land. No hard feelings. Eleanor let out a short laugh. Oh, there are plenty of hard feelings, Mr. Hayes. But if you're finally doing the right thing, I won't stand in your way. Rebecca crossed her arms. And what about the other people you've done this to? Raymond shifted uncomfortably. That's none of your business. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Oh, I think it is. Eleanor stared at Raymond, letting the weight of her silence settle over him. He shifted his stance, still Waltery uneasy, but she wasn't about to let him off that easy. You expect me to believe you're just going to walk away? She asked, her voice edged with suspicion. That after pulling the same stunt on who knows how many people, you suddenly decided to do the right thing? Raymond sighed, glancing toward his truck. Look, I'm a businessman. Sometimes deals don't work out. This one, well, it's not worth the trouble anymore. Rebecca let out a sharp laugh. You mean it's not worth the public embarrassment you're facing? That's why you're backing off. Raymond's jaw tightened. Think what you want. Eleanor shook her head. You don't get to slither away that easy, Hayes. My land isn't the only one you've tried to take. And as far as I'm concerned, you shouldn't get to pull a stunt like this ever again. Walter, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. She's right. You're just gonna move on to your next victim, unless someone stops you. Raymond's lips pressed into a thin line. What do you want from me? Eleanor took a slow step forward. I want you to come clean. Not just to me, but to everyone you've done this to. I want you to call Lisa Grayson, the reporter, and tell her exactly what you did. Every name. Every shady deal. Every official you paid off. Raymond's face paled. You're asking me to destroy my own business. Eleanor folded her arms. No, you destroyed it when you decided to steal from people. Now you can either come clean, or I'll make sure this story spreads far beyond one local news station. Rebecca smirked. Oh, and believe me, I will make it go viral. Raymond hesitated. His gaze flicked between them, calculating. Then finally he exhaled sharply. Fine. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Fine what? I'll call the reporter, Raymond muttered. I'll tell her what I did. Eleanor studied him carefully. We'll be listening. Raymond pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. With a reluctant sigh, he dialed the number. Lisa Grayson? It's Raymond Hayes, he said when she answered. I have something to tell you. As he started speaking, Eleanor exchanged a glance with Rebecca and Walter. They weren't just saving her land anymore. They were stopping a crook from ever doing this again. Rusty, sensing the shift in energy, wagged his tail at Eleanor's feet. She reached down, scratching behind his ears. This fight had been tough, but she had won. And in the end, right had triumphed over wrong. 1 week later, Eleanor sat on her porch, sipping sweet tea as a cool breeze rustled the trees. The last few days had been a whirlwind. Raymond Hayes' confession had made headlines across the county. Lisa Grayson's updated report had exposed not only his illegal land grabs, but also the corrupt officials who had helped him forge records. Now Raymond's company was under investigation, and several families who had lost their land were fighting to get it back. Eleanor had spent years tending her garden, thinking of it as her own small world, but now she realized she had been part of something much bigger. Rebecca stepped outside, holding her phone. You're not gonna believe this, she said, shaking her head. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Try me. Rebecca grinned and turned the screen toward her. It was an article from a major news outlet, headline bold and clear. Land fraud scandal rocks county. Businessman confesses to years of deception. Beneath it, a picture of Raymond Hayes, looking pale and defeated as he walked out of his office, surrounded by reporters. Well, would you look at that? Eleanor murmured, amused. Guess he finally got what was coming to him. Walter chuckled as he joined them on the porch. I'd say he got off light compared to what he did to folks. Rebecca nodded. Some of the families he scammed are already taking legal action. One couple he cheated out of their home is suing for everything he's got left. Eleanor took a slow sip of tea. Good. Let him know what it feels like to have someone take what's his. Rusty, lying at her feet, let out a happy bark. Eleanor reached down to scratch his head. And to think, all of this started because you ran into the road. Rebecca laughed. Yep. You saving Rusty set off a chain reaction that took down an entire fraud operation. You might have just become a local legend, and Eleanor. Eleanor smirked. I don't need to be a legend. I just needed to keep my land. Walter tipped his hat. Well, you did that. And a whole lot more. Eleanor let the satisfaction settle in her chest. She had fought for what was hers. She had stood her ground. And now the land she loved would remain in her family for generations to come. She looked out at her garden, the place she had poured her heart into for decades. It was still hers. It would always be hers. And that was a victory worth savoring. It had been a long week, but for the first time in a while Eleanor could finally breathe easy. The land was safe, Raymond Hayes was getting what he deserved, and her beloved garden remained untouched. Still, even with the victory fresh in her mind, Eleanor found herself restless. Something about the entire ordeal left her wondering, how many other people had been scammed like this? How many had lost their homes, their land, their legacy without ever knowing they could fight back? She leaned forward in her rocking chair, watching as Rusty chased a butterfly across the yard. Maybe it's not enough, she murmured. Rebecca, who had been scrolling through her phone nearby, looked up. What's not enough? This. Eleanor gestured around her. Stopping Raymond Hayes was one battle. But what about the folks who already lost everything? Who's making sure they get their land back? Rebecca frowned. I mean, some of them are filing lawsuits, but that takes forever. And not everyone has the money to fight. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Exactly. Walter stepped onto the porch, sipping his coffee. You look like a woman with a plan. Eleanor pursed her lips, then nodded. Maybe I am. Rebecca sat up straighter. Oh no, what are you thinking? Eleanor tapped her fingers against the arm of her chair. I'm thinking it's time folks around here knew how to fight back before it's too late. Time they knew the law before crooks like Hayes take advantage of them. Walter raised an eyebrow. And how do you plan to do that? Eleanor let out a slow breath. I don't know yet. But I'm not done fighting. If you're yet to like the video, do so now so more people can find the story. And let's know in the comments where you're watching from. 3 weeks later. Eleanor stood at the front of the local community center, looking out at a packed room. Farmers, retirees, small business owners, people who had built their lives on their land, sat in folding chairs, eager to listen. Rebecca clicked the laptop, pulling up the first slide on the projector. It read in bold letters. Know your land rights, protecting what's yours. Eleanor cleared her throat. Afternoon, everybody, she began, her voice steady and strong. If you're here today, it means you care about protecting your home, your land, and your family's future. And let me tell you right now, you can fight back when someone tries to take it from you. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Eleanor smiled. I was in your shoes not too long ago. A man came onto my property claiming I didn't own what was mine. If I hadn't stood my ground, I'd have lost everything. But I fought and I won. And today, I'm here to make sure you know how to do the same. Applause filled the room. Rebecca leaned over and whispered, Told you, Aunt Eleanor. You are a legend. Eleanor chuckled. Maybe so. But more importantly, she was ready to fight for others. The energy in the room was electric. People weren't just listening, they were engaged. Eleanor could see it in their eyes. Some had come with curiosity, but now they leaned forward with determination. These were hardworking folks just like her who had spent decades building their lives. And now they were realizing they had more power than they thought. Rebecca clicked to the next slide. It displayed a list of key legal rights for landowners, things Eleanor wished she had known before Raymond Hayes ever darkened her doorstep. One of the biggest tricks these developers and scammers pull is making you think you don't have time, Eleanor said, pacing in front of the crowd. They pressure you. They confuse you with legal talk. And before you know it, you've signed something you don't understand. Several people nodded. One man in the back muttered, That's exactly what happened to my cousin. Eleanor pointed at him. That's why you gotta know your rights before they come knocking. She walked back to the podium, adjusting her reading glasses. Here's the first thing you need to remember. Never sign anything without having a lawyer look at it first. Rebecca chimed in, clicking to the next slide. And if you can't afford a lawyer, there are free legal aid groups that can help. We've put together a list of resources at the end of this presentation. Eleanor smiled at her niece, proud of the work they had done together. She turned back to the crowd. Second thing, always check your property records. Scammers like Hayes love to file fake documents, claiming they own what's yours. If you're not checking, you won't even know until it's too late. A woman in the front raised her hand. How do we check? Rebecca pulled up another slide. Your county clerk's office has all the records. You can go in person, or most counties have online databases. If you see anything suspicious, challenge it immediately. Eleanor took a deep breath. And the last thing, don't be afraid to fight. Developers bank on you getting scared. They expect you to back down. But when you stand firm, when you push back, you make it harder for them to win. A round of applause broke out. People were nodding, taking notes, whispering to their neighbors. Walter, standing near the back, grinned. Looks like you've started something big, Eleanor. She smiled, gripping the podium. I didn't start it, she said. Folks like us have been fighting for our land for generations. I'm just making sure we finish it. As the presentation wrapped up, people came forward to thank her. Some wanted more resources, others wanted to share their stories. And in that moment, Eleanor realized this wasn't just a one-time event. This was her new fight. As the meeting wrapped up, people lingered, discussing their own experiences and exchanging information. Eleanor listened carefully, offering words of encouragement where she could. It was clear that this was just the beginning. So many people had been misled, pressured, or outright deceived when it came to their land. Rebecca gathered the leftover pamphlets they had printed and stacked them neatly. Aunt Eleanor, this was a huge success, she said. People want to fight back. They just didn't know how before. Eleanor nodded, watching as an older couple spoke with Walter about their property concerns. That's how folks like Raymond Hayes get away with it for so long. People feel alone, like they don't have any options. Walter walked over, shaking his head. You wouldn't believe how many people here already had suspicions about shady land deals, but didn't know what to do. Eleanor sighed. That's why we can't stop with just this one meeting. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. You thinking about making this a regular thing? Eleanor folded her arms. Not just regular. Bigger. I want to take this across the county, maybe even the state. People don't know their rights, they can't fight back. But if we teach them, Walter grinned, then folks like Hayes won't stand a chance. Rebecca smiled. I think we can do it. We can start by setting up a website, maybe a social media page, somewhere people can go for updates and resources. Eleanor chuckled. You know I don't fool with all that internet business. Rebecca smirked. That's why I'll run it. You just keep doing what you do best, fighting and making people listen. Eleanor shook her head but couldn't help smiling. You're a smart one, I'll give you that. Just then, a woman in her 40s approached, clutching a folder. Ms. Johnson. Eleanor turned. That's me. The woman glanced around as if making sure no one was listening too closely. My name's Patricia Carrington. I think someone's trying to steal my land. Eleanor's expression grew serious. Tell me everything. Patricia took a deep breath and opened the folder, revealing copies of documents. I got a letter a few months ago from a developer saying my land wasn't properly deeded, that there was a discrepancy in the records. I thought it was a mistake, but when I went to the clerk's office, they said there was a new claim on part of my property. Rebecca frowned. Did you sign anything? Patricia shook her head. No, but I don't know how to fight this. Eleanor took the folder and examined the documents. The name listed under the claim made her blood boil. Raymond Hayes' company. Her jaw tightened. You're not alone in this, Patricia, she said firmly. And we're not going to let him take your land. This fight wasn't over yet. Eleanor's hands tightened around Patricia's folder. She had hoped Raymond Hayes would be out of the picture after their last battle, but it seemed the man wasn't ready to slither away just yet. She glanced at Walter and Rebecca. Looks like we've got some work to do. Walter let out a low whistle. That man doesn't quit, does he? Rebecca shook her head. No, but neither do we. Eleanor turned back to Patricia. First things first, let's get to the bottom of this so-called discrepancy. You said you checked with the county clerk's office. Patricia nodded. Yeah, but they didn't have any clear answers. Just told me I'd have to dispute the claim through the proper legal channels. She sighed. And that sounds expensive. Eleanor gave her a reassuring pat on the arm. Don't you worry about that just yet. We'll start by pulling all the records on your land, old deeds, surveys, anything we can find. If there's fraud, we'll expose it. Rebecca was already pulling out her phone. I'll contact a lawyer from the legal aid list we put together. If this is a shady deal, they'll know how to challenge it. Patricia exhaled, relief washing over her face. I can't thank you enough. I was starting to think I'd lose everything. Eleanor shook her head. Not on my watch. 2 days later. Eleanor, Walter, and Rebecca sat around Eleanor's kitchen table, Papers spread out in front of them. They had spent hours digging through Patricia's property records, comparing them against the new claim. Rebecca ran a finger down one of the documents. Here's the thing. This so-called discrepancy wasn't there until 3 months ago. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. And let me guess, 3 months ago is right around the time Raymond Hayes started sniffing around again? Walter set down his coffee cup. Sure looks that way. This isn't a real ownership dispute. It's another one of his tricks. Eleanor exhaled sharply. That snake. Rebecca pulled up an email on her phone. Good news is, the lawyer I talked to says we can challenge this. Since Patricia never signed anything and has proof she's been paying property taxes, she's got a strong case. Eleanor nodded. Good. Then we move fast. Walter leaned back in his chair. What's the plan? Eleanor folded her arms. First, we get Patricia to the courthouse to file a legal challenge. Then we take this story public. Rebecca grinned. You want to bring the heat? Eleanor smirked. Darn right I do. Raymond Hayes thought he could pull the same trick twice. He's about to learn that messing with my people is the worst mistake he could make. The next morning, Eleanor stood outside the county courthouse, her arms crossed as she watched Patricia take a deep breath before stepping inside. Walter and Rebecca flanked her, their expressions firm. They had spent the night preparing gathering documents, organizing evidence, and planning their approach. Patricia adjusted her purse strap. I don't know how people do this kind of thing every day, she muttered. I hardly slept. Eleanor placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're doing the right thing. Once this is on record, Hayes won't be able to pull any last-minute tricks. Rebecca pushed open the courthouse door. Let's get this filed before he even knows what's happening. Inside, they approached the clerk's desk. The woman behind the counter, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on her nose, looked up. Morning. What can I do for y'all? Patricia hesitated for only a second before speaking. I need to file a challenge against a fraudulent claim on my land. She slid the paperwork across the desk. The clerk took a moment to review it, then nodded. You've got everything in order. This will trigger a legal review. Whoever's making the claim will have to provide proof. Eleanor smirked. And I'd love to see what kind of proof Raymond Hayes tries to come up with. The clerk stamped the paperwork. All right, Miss Carrington, you're officially in the system. The county will send notices to all parties involved. If the claim is fraudulent, it'll be dismissed. Patricia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That's it. For now, the clerk said. But be prepared. If the other party pushes back, this could end up in a hearing. Eleanor nodded. We'll be ready. As they stepped out of the courthouse, Walter turned to Eleanor. So what's next? Eleanor's eyes gleamed. Now? We make sure everyone knows exactly what Raymond Hayes is up to. 2 hours later, Eleanor and Rebecca sat across from a young reporter at the local news station. A camera crew adjusted their equipment while the reporter, a sharp-looking woman named Marissa Dawson, scrolled through the notes Rebecca had sent over. This is quite the story, Marissa said, looking up. A known developer making fraudulent land claims? That's something people will care about. That's exactly why we're here, Eleanor said. This isn't just about Patricia Carrington. He's done this before, and he'll do it again if nobody stops him. Marissa nodded. Let's make sure everyone hears about it. The red light on the camera blinked on. The interview had begun. The next day, Raymond Hayes was furious. Eleanor sat on her porch, sipping coffee, as Rebecca read aloud from an online news article. Listen to this, Rebecca said, grinning. Developer Raymond Hayes accused of fraudulent land deals, local residents fight back. It's all over town. She scrolled down. They even included a quote from Patricia Carrington. I was scared at first, but now I know we can fight. This land belongs to my family, and I won't let anyone take it from us. Eleanor chuckled. Good. She needed to find her voice. Walter, leaning against the porch railing, smirked. And I bet Hayes is losing his mind right about now. As if on cue, Eleanor's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Speak of the devil. Rebecca leaned forward. Are you going to answer? Eleanor took her time pressing the button. Might as well. She put the phone on speaker. Hayes! Raymond's voice came through, tight with barely concealed rage. Are you trying to ruin me? Eleanor set her coffee down. No, you did that yourself when you tried stealing land from people who worked for it. You don't understand, eh? Oh, I understand just fine, Eleanor interrupted. You've made a living scamming folks who don't have the means to fight back. But this time, you messed with the wrong person. Raymond exhaled sharply. Listen, I can make this go away. Eleanor's lips curled. No, you listen. Patricia's claim is filed, the county is reviewing your so-called ownership, and now the whole town knows who you really are. There is no going back for you. Silence stretched over the line. Then Raymond's voice dropped, quieter but more threatening. You're making a mistake, Eleanor. Walter's expression darkened. Rebecca narrowed her eyes. Eleanor, however, simply smiled. No, Hayes. You made the mistake when you thought I was an easy target. She hung up. Rebecca let out a low whistle. Well, that went well. Walter folded his arms. Think he's gonna try something? Eleanor exhaled. I'd be surprised if he didn't. Rebecca smirked. Good thing we have the upper hand. Eleanor nodded. The fight wasn't over yet, but Hayes was running out of moves. The next morning, Eleanor stood in her garden, running her fingers through the soft leaves of her tomato plants. The air was crisp and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. Then she heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. She turned just in time to see a sleek black truck pull up to her driveway. Raymond Hayes stepped out. Rebecca, watching from the porch, immediately pulled out her phone. Oh, this ought to be good, she muttered, ready to record. Walter stepped outside, his arms crossed. Rusty stood by Eleanor's side, ears perked, his body tense. Eleanor, calm as ever, dusted her hands off on her jeans. Well, she said. Didn't expect to see you here. Raymond shut the truck door, his jaw tight. We need to talk. Eleanor smirked. Funny. You said that last time and it didn't go too well for you. Raymond took a step forward, lowering his voice. Look, I'll make you an offer. Rebecca scoffed. You've got to be kidding. Raymond ignored her. He pulled a folded document from his pocket. I'll sign over the land rights officially. No more loopholes, no more tricks. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. And what do you want in return? Raymond hesitated. Then with a sigh he said, You go to the press and tell them the whole thing was a misunderstanding. You clear my name. Rebecca let out a sharp laugh. Oh, that's rich. You want us to lie to save your reputation. Raymond clenched his jaw. Look, I get it. You won. But I've got investors, projects, a career. This scandal is tanking everything. If you back off, we can both walk away clean. Eleanor stared at him for a long moment. Then she stepped closer, her voice deadly calm. You think I care about your career, Hayes? You think I'm going to let you scam the next person just because you handed me some paper? Raymond's face darkened. You have no idea what you're messing with. Eleanor's eyes gleamed. Neither do you. Rebecca, still filming, smirked. So, Mr. Hayes, are you admitting that you've scammed other people? Raymond paled. This conversation is over. He turned sharply and stormed back to his truck. As the vehicle sped away, Walter let out a low chuckle. Well, that didn't go the way he planned. Eleanor dusted off her hands again. No, it didn't. And now? We finished this. Rebecca stopped recording, grinning. Can't wait to post this one. Raymond Hayes had played his last card. And he had lost. The very next morning, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee as Rebecca scrolled through her phone. Every few seconds, her niece would grin and shake her head. You're going to love this, Rebecca said. That video I posted of Hayes basically admitting he's a scam artist? It's blowing up. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Define blowing up. Rebecca turned the screen toward her. Over 50,000 views in less than 24 hours. And the best part? The state attorney general's office just announced an official investigation into Hayes's business. Walter, sitting across from them, let out a low whistle. That man is done. Eleanor smirked. Good. He thought he could bully people into giving up what was theirs. Now he's going to learn what it feels like to lose. Just then the phone rang. Rebecca picked it up, glanced at the caller ID and grinned. It's Lisa Grayson. Eleanor nodded for her to answer. Lisa, tell me you've got good news. Rebecca put the phone on speaker. Lisa's voice crackled through. Good news? Try great news. Hayes's company just released a statement saying he's stepping down as CEO. Eleanor let out a satisfied sigh. Looks like the pressure finally got to him. Lisa continued. Not only that, but multiple former employees are coming forward with evidence of forged documents. He's looking at serious fraud charges. Rebecca grinned. We really did it. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. No, we didn't just do it. The whole town did. Lisa chuckled. You're a local hero, Eleanor. What's next for you? Eleanor thought for a moment, glancing out the window at her garden, the land she had fought so hard to keep. Next? I keep doing what I've always done, she said with a small smile. I take care of what's mine. And if anyone else ever needs help fighting back, well, she looked at Rebecca and Walter. They both grinned. I think we've got plenty of fight left in us. Lisa laughed. Something tells me Raymond Hayes won't be the last crook to underestimate you. Eleanor smirked. No, I reckon he won't. As the call ended, Rebecca raised a toast with her coffee cup. To Eleanor Tate, the woman who took down Raymond Hayes. Walter chuckled and lifted his own cup. And to never messing with Southern women and their land. Eleanor clinked her cup against theirs. Rusty barked as if in agreement, wagging his tail. She smiled down at him. That's right, boy. This land is ours, and always will be. And with that, Eleanor finally felt it. Peace. The battle was won. Her home was safe. And Raymond Hayes? He was nothing more than a bad memory. Like the video and subscribe the channel so we can bring you more stories like this one.